Okay, good. Welcome back. I want to introduce Stephen Smith to you. Stephen is an old friend of mine. I worked in Brockwood for almost 9 years, but I arrived in 1995 and he had just left. He had left in 1992. But almost from the 70s, early 70s, till 1992, he worked at Brockwood as a teacher. And for those who have been looking at the YouTube videos, you can spot him in the audience, discussions at the school, but you can also spot him in small group discussions. Stephen has worked also at the KFA later on. That's from 1998 till somewhat around 2005. Has been an editor. He was the first line editor of The World Within, the book. And and he wrote, over the years, he has done several presentations here at the May Gathering and also in various other places all over the world. He has, with his wife, Wendy Smith, who's the archivist, international archivist for the Krishnamurti Foundations. They maintain an ongoing schedule of traveling between Ojai, Brockwood, and India. So I would like to ask Stephen to come. The title of his talk is going to be Pointers to the Quiet Mind. So, thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's rather strange to be talking to the world when there's only a very small representation of the world here, but I guess you're all out there, so I've called my talk Pointers to the Quiet Mind because the theme of the gathering is the quiet mind, and hopefully this will be conducive to some kind of questioning and discussion, and as far as we can make it, dialogue. Okay? Great. Yeah. Pointers to the quiet mind. It is a colossal anomaly, to say the least, that the quiet mind we are seeking cannot be sought. Indeed, it seems a contradiction in terms. Normally, we form an image of what we seek, be it wealth, success, power, or pleasure, and satisfy ourselves that there is some correspondence between the image and the thing sought. Probably, when we get what we want, it is not the same as what we had imagined, but there is sufficient similarity between the image and reality to ensure that we do not lose track of what we're after. In other words, there is a likeness, much as there is between a photo and a face. But the quiet mind is not like that. And to begin with, why do we need it? We need it because our current consciousness, what Krishnamurti calls consciousness as we know it, is inadequate to meet the challenges it is facing. Homo sapiens, the knowing man-mind, has obviously reached the end of its tether. As a species, perhaps, we can deal with the coronavirus. But climate change, as Greta Thunberg has pointed out, remains an unsolved, pressing problem. Even though the science is equally clear, arrogant self-interest and nationalistic exclusivity are blocking the way to a sensible solution. Nowhere more so than in this country, where elected leaders are themselves the generators of chaos and destruction on a massive scale. Why do we not feel responsible, all of us, for this big, blue, beautiful, floating ball of a planet? Why? Is it that the very knowledge we have cultivated and by which we are defined has deadened our finer sensibilities, reducing us to thought machines? Would we, if we had the feeling of the Hopi Indians who see themselves long ago emerging from the earth, have perpetrated this violation? Not to romanticize, but it is unlikely. The state of the world is the product of our consciousness. It is not a given, an adjunct, or an out-there phenomenon. We generate the world with everything we do, from the simplest, humblest domestic task to dropping the atom bomb on Hiroshima. At no point are we exempt. But, as with the planet, we are blocked against ourselves. It is always someone else's fault. We do not realize the commonality of consciousness, that we are individually and collectively responsible. And until we do, nothing much will change. There may be treaties, agreements, improvements of a kind, but the underlying movement of separation from the source will inevitably lead to further fragmentation. This is why Krishnamurti insists that the only true response is a religious response. We may travel to the moon, set up shop there, we shall still be in the same boat, exploiting and exploited, the rulers and the ruled. It lies in the secret heart of man to bring about the change we so desperately need, and that is where the quiet mind comes in. Anyone familiar with Sanskrit chanting will know that many of the best-known chants end with the words Om Shanti, 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 peace, peace, peace. They are also, incidentally, the final words of that modernist masterpiece, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. They were chanted more than 2,000 years ago, but still the blessing of peace eludes us. And the parish priest, in dismissing the congregation, speaks of the peace that passeth all understanding. But we do not know that peace, we do not live there. More often than not, it is quite the reverse. Thoughts pursue us night and day, from the anxious projected to the trivial and commonplace. A mind at rest and at peace is rare, and yet it is obvious that a peaceful world can only be built by peaceful people. We are the only building blocks. The quiet mind, then, it seems, is the portal through which this other infiltration can come. It is not to be had by prayer or meditation, which are different forms of asking to be led, but only by rigorous self-inquiry, the unflinching exploration of the self. For the self, the I, is both the problem and the solution. The problem because it is the accumulation of conditioning, personal, familial, social and local, national, international, and species-wide. The solution because this is the very terrain that we must go into if we are to know ourselves. The word know in this context may be confusing, since it immediately suggests a body of knowledge, something acquired from which we act. Normally, this is the case. But here we are talking present tense, knowing, the capacity latent in human beings to be fully aware not only of the past and of the past impinging on the present, but of the presence of the present as it unfolds. In other words, there can be an awareness which, by its total perceptual nature, frees one on the instant from the shackles of the past, the entire accumulation of conditioning, the me. The door stands open at every moment. What then prevents us from stepping through? Surely, one of the reasons is the unquiet mind, the mind that is constantly chattering, that seeks and finds multiple entertainments. And the last thing this is entertainment. It is much too serious for that. Being itself unquiet, the mind seeks comfort in distraction, of which in our time there is an increasing volume. Wherever we look, there is this strange preoccupation, this self-absorption, not in self-inquiry, but in the multiple manifestations of the me. If you were asked by a stranger what Krishnamurti said, you would probably answer, the observer is the observed, to be is to be related, or you are the world and the world is you. These are his Mahavakyas, his great pronouncements or statements. So easy to see, to say, so little understood. But they lay at the very heart not only of the teachings, but of our signal failure to grasp and live their meaning. Because modern education has developed the intellect, we tend to treat everything intellectually. We doubt, we question, we ruminate, we analyze, thinking thereby to come to something. But the very instrument is wrong. It cannot accomplish what it sets out to do. Concepts breed concepts, and that is our dilemma. Our understanding remains at the conceptual level, fascinating in itself, but ultimately hollow. It is the plane of logic, of voluminous extension, of themes and variations, ways and means, in other words, the field of measure. But it does not deliver because it cannot deliver the clarity of living truth. We are looking in the wrong place, like Mullah Nasruddin in the Sufi story. You may have heard of Mullah Nasruddin. He's an example of the wise fool, and he's particularly well known in the Sufi tradition, but I believe also the replications in Japanese tradition and other places. A policeman is walking around the town one night doing his rounds, seeing everybody's safe, and he comes upon a man who is walking round and round in a pool of light cast by a street light. So he goes up to him and says, well, what are you doing? And the mullah says, I'm looking for the key to my house. And the policeman says, well, did you lose it over here? The mullah says, no, I lost it over there by my house. So the policeman says, well, why are you looking here? He says, there's more light over here. If you get it. This is the conceptual light. We hear these statements intellectually, conceptually, but in actual fact, they are perceptual. They are to do with existential truth, with seeing, not with literal meaning, which is thinking. It is an entirely different function for the brain. The two are not alike at all. They are of a piece with the word is not the thing. To look at a tree, you don't need the word tree. The word is just a pointer to the thing. Similarly, you are the world is a pointer to a fact. It cannot be arrived at by analysis. It requires an instantaneous act of perception whereby the falseness of the division is seen, not two, not separate. You are the world. It is a matter, in a sense, of letting it sink in. It cannot be grasped in the usual way. Kay speaks of being soaked in it. Its penetration is osmotic. It is apprehended not by seeking, striving, or surrendering, but by allowing its truth to simply be. It is, at one and the same time, subjective and impersonal. The same for all, but uniquely one's own. The little self of time and conditioning opens into a wider world. Indeed, it is perceived as nothing else. It is the ultimate unity. It cannot be repeated, but it can be lived, and it is this living quality that defines it. By comparison, thought is dead. We have moved then from the world of things and ideas to the world of unity, the world of the true I. It is a different dimension altogether, and perhaps it is the home of the quiet mind. The quiet mind, remember, is not a goal. It is not the fruit of practice or experience. It isn't something you arrive at in the end. Either it is there or it is not. There is no halfway house no compromise. And that is the difficulty for most of us. Kale often spoke of taking a journey, the journey into oneself that is at the heart of things. It is, as we have said, at one and the same time subjective and impersonal. Two branches barely grown, at least barely grown together, on the Western tree of knowledge, which is our heritage. We have, on the one hand, objective scientific thinking, the universe as a machine via Newton and Descartes, and subjectively our private lives, the little world we inhabit with its personal narrative. Between these two modes there is a huge gap, and it goes a long way to explaining why the world we live in is characterized by social dislocation, mental disorientation, metaphysical confusion, and personal distress. How can one live in such an alienated world? The answer is, millions barely do. The quiet desperation of Henry David Thoreau has now reached fever pitch, and Earth herself is crying. The backdrop of meaning has fallen from our lives, leaving us with our daily selves. These we cultivate assiduously, trying to forge significance out of their narrow narratives. But, however much we stretch it, our narrative remains narrow. It is limited by our conditioning, and that very conditioning reinforces it. It is also noticeable, the further west one travels, the stronger this narcissistic self-absorption gets. It is an article of faith that this is all we've got, and all we can do is expand it to the full. Ultimately, the image rules. This is a dangerous state of affairs, one which, with ever-expanding technology, unfolds before our eyes on a daily basis. Truth and authenticity are themselves under siege. Is it possible, then, the question asks itself, for the very sense of I to be examined as it moves? If it is, we make a shift from the assertion of the self, and conditioning is largely a series of assertions, to the questioning of the self, to negative thinking, which Kay describes as the highest form of thinking. It is high in the sense that it is an open door, that a priori it asserts nothing, and that it is able to live with its own groundlessness, its own non-attachment to anything at all. It is in a state of suspension between possibilities, but into it pours no voice from the past, no compulsion to act in one way or the other. In other words, it is a place of space, a timeless interval between two warring factions, a terrain untenanted, a quiet mind. For, of all its qualities, the quiet mind is not a thing. The reification process has ceased. The mind as we know it, the thought machine, lives on and by the things it creates, and it seeks to make the process continuous. This is why the open door, the place of space, is significant. Its very existence is a questioning of assertion, particularly the assertion of continuity. For if the I is not continuous, then what is it? It is merely a fragment enfolded in thought, with no jurisdiction over or command of thought. Its thinking itself otherwise is an abstraction. But once a thing has been made by thought, and this process of thing-making is endemic to it, just try unthinking a thought, for instance, it seems to acquire a life of its own. Like the idea of God, for example. Other things defer to it, were even made by it, and are destined to meet it in the end. In other words, what we miss in all this is the fact that thought is a material process, a phrase we owe to David Bohm and Krishnamurti, and that its projections are inevitably limited. We miss or overlook their essential nothingness, no-thingness. This is the nothing that inhabits each moment and round which each moment turns like water round a vortex. Negative thinking is the clue to this discovery. Once it is engendered in a person's brain, it develops its own way of operating. At first, it is like a strange new language, though the basis of it is silence, not words. It operates without one's volition. The body, it is said, has its own intelligence, unrelated to the machinations of thought. It can be fed, rested, watered, and given exercise. It can make itself useful in many ways. And as Homo sapiens, it goes upright, a crucial development in our evolution. But sadly, it is frequently abused. It serves as a vehicle for our pleasures and suffers the pain that inevitably ensues. It has its own rhythms, and when thought is not too active, a natural way of being at ease. The soft animal of your body, as Mary Oliver puts it. We need to honor, not push and punish it, not indulge it or lay it waste in the pursuit of some ideal, some image of perfection that goes back to the Greeks. We are so ignorant of our consciousness, its history and structure, that we are easily manipulated, and the body pays the price. It has been paying the price for thousands of years through fasting, flagellation, going on one's knees, suppression, sublimation, all to find that one thing. But it is not in these practices, nor indeed in any practices, because they are deliberate devices with a certain goal in mind. They belong to the mechanical order of thought. And whatever thought conceives, imagines, or projects is limited to its own sphere. In this sense, and for this reason, it misses the mark, which is the original meaning of the word sin. And we miss, very largely, because we do not listen. We are so engrossed in our own thought world that the whisperings and intimations of living reality elude us. Only, perhaps, when we are alone in nature does the sense of a quickened reality emerge. Then, when the body is vibrant and moving, we become part of something greater than ourselves. Joie de vivre comes naturally, inexhaustibly. It seems then, in that awakened state, that truth is inhabiting the body itself, establishing its own rhythm, its own way of life. The past as a thought structure fades away, and one lives only in the radiant present, not, unfortunately, for very long. In a talk in Colombo, Sri Lanka, on 20th of January 1957, Krishnamurti says, "If you really watch yourself as you listen, you will find a radical change taking place in spite of your conscious mind. It is the conscious mind, which is consciousness as we know it, that is the stumbling block in all of this. For it creates via conditioning its own frame of reference and pulls everything into it. It all becomes past tense." In this quotation, it is the "in spite of" that is significant. Something perhaps at a deeper level, something to do with the intelligence of the body, though this is speculative at present, is able to receive what the conscious mind cannot, enclosed and preoccupied as it is with its daily cares and far-flung aspirations. It is like a seed, Kay says, that being sown in fertile soil pushes through the earth and puts out a blossom. Every oak tree, after all, began life as an acorn. The perceptual possibility exists. Time and deferment are no help at all, for they only delay what must be done anyway. It behoves us to look at ourselves as we are, in the mirror of daily relationship. The quiet mind, which is itself the mirror, lies at a deeper level than thought. It is what is, abidingly, when the waves on the surface subside and are still. Perhaps it is even who we are when all is silent, when we come home, so to speak, to ourselves. The silent mind is a sort of death. It is the end of the fuss, the palaver, the noise. It is different in kind from the movement of thought. Thought remembers, evaluates, weighs and measures. It reflects on its experience. But the quiet mind of the I is present to itself. It seeks nothing other than itself, and as such, it is complete. Naturally, this is only the beginning, intimate as death, but only a beginning. What we have been calling a portal is just that. It is a gateway, an entrance into something vast, something beyond the measure of man's mind. It begins with the statements, "You are the world, the observer is the observed," etc. These are pointers to the quiet mind, and in fact cannot be seen unless the mind is quiet. Otherwise, they are just words and ideas, just concepts and theories, the litany of thought. As such, they do not and will not change lives. It is a different ground that we so desperately need, for, as we said at the beginning, the mind that we have is not adequate to the task. Its multiple inventions are along the same line and cannot fathom the depths of our new being. It is there, at that level, that we need a revolution, not in sticks and stones and the revolutions of the outer. These have been and gone, leaving humankind the same, still greedy, still aggressive, still pursuing shadows. It is a revolution, a mutation within consciousness itself, related to, not different from, the world it has created. It is not a matter of change yourself, then change the world. The two are not separate, they are the same stuff, or rather two aspects of the same stuff, consciousness and matter, which is a further topic. And a change in one betokens a change in the other. We live in an interconnected universe where the flutter of a butterfly's wing alters the weather somewhere else. None of our thoughts, even, are exclusively our own. How then not see, if this is so, how critically important our state of mind and being is? It isn't something we can attend to later when we have settled more important matters. Nothing is more important than what we are. Nothing, including the current pandemic, is closer to home and more in need of attention. But we have to see its urgency. And paradoxically, this can only be done when the mind is quiet and aware of everything, for in that still pool, things are seen as they are. The quiet mind, then, is not one option among many. It is the sine qua non of real perception. It is the matrix of perception, the first and last step. Without it, we commit ourselves willy-nilly to a life of false starts and unhappy endings. With it, we lay a groundwork in ourselves against which the whole field of experience can play out without engendering false hopes. By coming to ourselves, which the quiet mind is, we eliminate expectation and projection. We come into the moment, which is all we have. In so doing, we complete the circle which began with the quest for the quiet mind. It is not through time that it can come to us, not through struggle, not through effort, nor through practice of any kind. It consists in setting aside what is false, what is psychologically put together by thought. The action of time thought cannot undo the very things it has constructed. It requires a different instrument. If time thought asserts, negative thinking deconstructs. by unmaking the reifications of thought, by questioning and doubting their validity, we reach deeper into the well of consciousness. Not reaching the bottom, there is no bottom, suspending affiliation to the seeming real. In this non-aligned state, we disentangle ourselves from the hooks and hardnesses of our conditioning, recovering as we go the soft animal of our body. We come into our own space. Eternally present, it is for the first time, never before witnessed. It feels like home. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. You're gonna. You were almost exactly on half an hour, which is of course amazing.
Yeah, it is rather good. Yeah.
So we're the format is, and just because of technicalities, that we, Corey and I, Corey Fisher, for the people on the YouTube, is the archivist and publications director of the Krishnamurti Foundation. And both of us are somehow going to engage in a discussion with you. Mm-hmm. We thought the first 20 minutes, we will just talk about some things related to the talk you just gave. Mm-hmm. And then we allow you to sit down. Mm-hmm. We give you, if you do well, we give you a chair. And then we open up the topic a little bit wider, and including there are some questions from online which we will bring in from various people who have been watching.
Right.
And I don't know. I can start. I don't know if Corey has a question first, but I mean I
can. Yeah, I'll jump in because it was towards the beginning of your talk, sort of a question and observation, and something that I think makes or points to maybe the bigness and maybe the difficulty of what we're discussing. Is you mentioned the state of the world is a product of our consciousness,
right?
And so a question of that is, I wonder if because of that fact we're so accustomed to it, we don't quite even know, do we know how to attend to that? Because of how accustomed we are to the way the world is. So it's a matter of how do we frame this kind of looking and this question about what the possibilities are for something different. How do we know how to recognize what actually is the case and why it is the case? I don't know if that makes sense, but I thought that was an interesting point to bring out.
Yes. No, it's very interesting. I think the key point is realizing that the two are not separate. The consciousness and its products are not separate. Consciousness is not, it's not just, the world itself rather, is not just, it's not just there as a fixed reality. It's actually constantly changing, and what's changing is the consciousness itself. So the consciousness, something to do with consciousness and matter, even although I think that's probably too abstract. It's as the consciousness changes, then it changes the way people behave in certain ways, at least, and then that becomes the world. That's then the world as we know it, and so we rarely see, I think very few people see actually, or even consider that consciousness and world are basically the same. I am the world, you are the world, because we're generating it all the time. We're not passive observers because of this thing about egotistical self-isolation. We think there's a world out there that has nothing to do with this world in here, or it's something I can mess around with or manipulate according to my desire. But actually it isn't. You know, it's something that's moving and changing all the time. That's why I said that the simplest, humblest domestic task is also part of it in some way. If you do it in an orderly way, in a calm way, that also is, that adds to the orderliness and calmness of the world, at least the world you're living in. And Krishnamurti said, often begin small, don't begin with the huge tapestry of existence. Begin with something very small. And then one can develop that and introduce order into things in general. But I don't think we see this gap between the two, and that's the problem. It's a perceptual problem, not a conceptual problem. That was the main point I wanted to make. It's not a conceptual problem, it's perceptual. It's how you see things as being.
Can I like to, because I know you were there in Brockwood when Krishnamurti was an integral part of Brockwood, of course, and in many discussions and talks. And I always felt there's a whole, a body of work of Krishnamurti engaging with students and teachers, which is barely being touched upon. It's hardly it's not published. And in one of these discussions, because I was in Brockwood, of course, also for a long time, and I had access to all that material, and I would, and I remember you had this paradox in Krishnamurti's, how he talked about meditation, because on one hand he would say, well, don't meditate until you're free, right? But on the other hand he would say, well, the students have to, they need to start at meditation. And he even had, despite the head of school in Brockwood at the time didn't want to organize meditation in the beginning, he would take a group of students separately and have half an hour of meditation, till at a certain point they were doing it every 10 minutes. And then also he would say to, in one of his discussions with staff, take the best time of your day, the best hour of your day, and lock yourself up in your room and be quiet. So there's always this kind of almost like apparent contradiction between him saying, no, don't meditate until you're free, which he would all say in the books, and at the same time he would actually say, no, you make sure during your day. So how do you reconcile that? How do you make?
Well, I think the first step, you can't really meditate until you're free. That's a statement about the nature of reality as a whole. And it's also a safeguard against the idea that by meditating you will get to this state, which I think he doesn't want to go there because it introduces the element of time. Now, when it comes to daily practical affairs, and especially with young people, it's not different, but the emphasis is different. Because they're probably not used to being quiet at all, for one thing. All that, particularly now, there's so many gadgets you can have, and you can be constantly tuning into something or other. If it's not your friends, it's something on the other end of the world, So there's this constant buzz of preoccupation going on. And that was there too, of course, before. So I think in some sense, education is like the practical arm of the teachings, if I can put it that way, It's the practical arm of the teachings, and how I actually got directly involved with Krishnamurti was through that, because I had the feeling when I read him, this sounds very good, but what do you do? How does it, in practical terms, make any difference? And I think he was probably himself conscious of that, because as soon as he was able, he starting schools after 1968, after a long, fallow period. So I think I think somewhere he acknowledged the necessity for that, for some kind of practical application, and that, as sitting quietly in Brockwood for 10 minutes, everybody together, was the way the day started. So it does have an impact, definitely.
But I mean, I'm asking that question partially also because somewhere in your talk that you just gave, you said it's almost despite of the things you're doing, something happens, but nevertheless you have to like somehow do things that increases the likelihood. Like if you're constantly being preoccupied, if you never create space, nothing will happen. So it's almost like, so how do you see that?
Yeah, I think setting time aside, I do it. Setting time aside when you're not doing anything, or just sitting quietly, or sitting in a quiet place, this is a quiet place. There are so many places like it, actually. So, I think it helps generate something which otherwise would not be generated. And that's why I brought in this thing about negative thinking, because it's a rare concept, everybody thinks, and thought in itself is assertive. It says, if you're a Christian, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and it's asserting all the time. It's saying, this is how it is. Whereas the negative thinking or the questioning or inquiry is asking, is this the way it is? Is this, it looks like a small shift, but actually it's huge. It's huge because you're now questioning the nature of reality. You're not asserting that it is one way or the other. That makes a huge difference.
But what does that do to the brain when that happens? Instead of asserting, questioning, there seem to be.
I think they're
touching upon something.
I think they're very different. They're very different because I think the assertion gives you the illusion of security because now I know God. What's the world? Oh, God made it. Says, I believe in that. Oh yeah. Oh well, Krishna's doing that. Or I make these assertions so that I sign up, so to speak, to the thing that I assert is so, and it becomes part of my being and daily life, But it may be quite illusory. It doesn't have any truth to it, really. Whereas questioning opens up the possibility that I think the difficulty is that it is a kind of state of suspension. It's not a state where you're necessarily very confident about what you're doing. You may be in some kind of confusion, but you're in confusion anyway. I mean, the person who's asserting is confused, actually. But with this, there's a sense in which you're going into the confusion rather than overlaying it with something that sounds solid, but which actually isn't. And more or less, the history of humankind is of building things that seem solid, but eventually they crumbled. Like the pyramids.
That brings out, I think, an important distinction that we see in his work, and I wonder maybe to expand upon that a bit, this distinction between the conceptual versus experiential in terms of, because I think it has a relationship to what does it mean, what is the value of sitting quietly not doing anything or exposing what's happening versus this overlay of sort of a conceptual understanding on top of what I feel or think.
Right. Well, I think there's a period of talking experientially. There's a certain discomfort in it, and this can be difficult for people not knowing. See, reification means you make a thing of things. So when you made a thing of, like you make this, well, it's okay so far as podiums or chairs are concerned because it's real and you can use it. But once you've made an idea into a thing and you use it in the same way, you're in trouble basically, because it's not so solid. So you have to live with this sense that it's this unease of what's actually going on. And I think that's the sort of somewhat the dark night of the soul, actually, that where you're not sure what the hell is happening, but you've lost these comforts, you've lost these moorings, you've lost these certainties. On the other hand, you know, the rest may seem quite nebulous. But the journey is, Kay used to talk a lot about taking a journey together and crossing the uncharted sea, and I think those are very just metaphors, actually, because you may feel lost, and but nevertheless there's a necessity to hang in there and perceive what you can. And that has a movement of its own. That quote from that talk in 1957, I actually took it from the Grey Calendar. It's the thing that something maybe, he says, if you're listening, something may be taking place in spite of your conscious mind. In other words, he's speaking to that.
Right.
You know, sages have rarely, they don't actually try to convince you of anything, but they talk to something else, basically. So that thing then can be awakened. That's the proposition.
Yeah, I remember, and you probably were there at the time when Krishnamurti discussed that with the teachers, like regarding their interactions with students, about can you talk to their unconsciousness?
Right.
Do you remember him talking about it?
I think that was a thing that was often on his mind, and he said it with Bohm too. In one day, you know, I was talking to your unconscious. So, by which he meant, of course, he was using unconscious in his own sense, something beyond the reach of the conscious mind. In other words, but you know, he could do that. But the ordinary mortal can't do that. But he could reach that layer.
But he seemed to have given the invitation. He said somehow that he would somehow imply that humans can do that, right? Teachers could do that.
Yeah, well, they can. Yeah, I mean, if they set the intention of doing it, there may be some, you know, there may be some mileage in it. Certainly, I think. One has to experiment with these things, particularly in the field of education. I mean, things have happened, but it's fairly small at the moment, really. There's a lot more could be done in terms of trying to open up this perceptual framework. That's the thing. The concepts, we've done it all, really, more or less. I mean, we're brilliant at it. And the technology, I mean, look what's happened in the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, it's extraordinary. You know, well, you said at the beginning, you know, 6 years ago it was all a bit fuzzy. Now you can cut your finger on it, you know. Yes. So, I mean, it's amazing what these things are, what we can do in that way. It's just that there needs to be a different kind of growth in a different direction. Or I would say not direction even, but at a different depth. So these other potentials are awakened.
In the you somewhere in your talk you mentioned the collective versus the personal or the impersonal.
Individual, collective and individual. Yeah.
So what did you mean by that? Because they appear at least very different, and so.
Oh, I see. Well, I think if we take this metaphor that Kate and Bohm used it also, the general matrix of consciousness, the socio-cultural inheritance of consciousness. It's like a stream or a river flowing, and from that the individual emerges, but also the collective emerges, because a number of individuals can decide to do something collectively, which, you know, the communists were doing that, for instance. So but it's still the same stuff. It's exactly the same stuff. It's just moving around somewhat differently. But it's the same stuff.
But it's interesting because you're saying there's an underlying, or you're somehow suggesting there's an underlying matrix from where the other emerges. Well, the perception is like there are components, and if you put the components together, this is the structure that you have. So how do you see that?
Well, I think putting the components together is an activity of thought, but it's a more overarching activity of thought. It's a more general and you might say philosophical or metaphysical function of thought, that you can arrange things in a certain way, and philosophies are often like that. So I don't see it as being in a different field or being a different function of the brain. When I spoke of a different function of the brain, it's rather something that is not determined by that, but determined by this movement of conceptualization and fragmentation, and it begins in a different place. And see, the brain of Krishnamurti, it seems, was being operated on for 50 years. Something was going on there, with intense pain often. So something was being opened up. Well, it's difficult to say what. Even he couldn't say what. So, but some new potential, some capacity to reach something that's not contaminated. Not contaminated by time, by experience, by knowledge, it's in a different field. And yeah, the quiet mind is a way into it, definitely. It may be just intimations, but...
So I mean, it's only one more minute to go, but I mean, maybe we can pick it up after the break. But do you feel that the quiet mind is something new? If you look at the evolution of humanity, that there's a new thing coming, or do you see? Well, that was something that was there. Animals already have it. Humans had it, then lost it, and now have to be. How do you see that?
I don't know if they ever had it, actually. I don't know if they ever had it in this sense, but there's always been this sense of something beyond the measure of man's mind. I think that has always been, people have looked for that and built temples to it and worshipped it, and so I think there's been I think there's been an acknowledgement of it, definitely. But if you look at it from the Krishnamurti point of view, you would say, well, they were okay in their time and in their place and for a certain period. Perhaps they did shift something, but it's not enough. I mean, that's with him, it was never enough. So
okay, we'll look at this more after the break. So we're gonna break for a few minutes, and then we'll open the stream again.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah. Good.